Mark is a senior scholar with the New America Foundation and somebody who I've only met through this process, but I think the thing that I've been most impressed with is that in addition to the careful intellectual rigor of the work that Mark has put forward, because Mark has been one of the creative fountains of the kind of reforms that might come out. Sometimes people who are careful thinkers don't have the guts to stand for very strong ideas. When you put them both together, you have a recipe for positive change. And I've seen that in Mark's writings and his speaking. He's going to talk to us both on how we could reform how the budget process occurs, but also how we are governed. Please welcome Mark Paul.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Talking about fiscal reform and also about remaking the California legislature, on the surface of things look like two subjects that really don't belong together very well together. But I hope that by the time I finish here in 10 minutes that I can convince you that they really are two halves of the same walnut. The need for fiscal reform in California is obvious. As Jim said, I doubt that any of us would be here on a Friday night in July, 11 blocks from the beach and who knows how many blocks from a good wine bar. If California, wasn't mired deep in a budget crisis that has now gone on for the better part of a decade, a crisis that now has the richest state in the richest nation in the history of the world sending out IOUs to pay its bills. And meanwhile, our elected leaders are trying to figure out how much more damage we can do to what was once the greatest higher education system in the world, how many more teachers we're going to lay off, how many children we're going to take away their health insurance from, and how many of the disabled we're going to force out of their homes and pack off to nursing homes because we won't pay $12 an hour to an in-home supportive worker. At the heart of the dysfunction that has led us to this crisis is California's crazy experiment, unique among the states, of requiring a two-thirds vote to pass both budget and tax bills. That experiment, I think it's fair to conclude, has utterly failed. It has undermined our fiscal stability and destroyed political accountability in the state. When the party elected as a majority in the legislature by voters cannot pass a budget on its own, voters cannot hold them responsible for the result. We've destroyed political accountability, and a system that doesn't have political accountability, isn't a good democratic system. But the dysfunction doesn't end there. State constitutions are supposed to establish the framework of organization of a state, to make the rules of the game by which we debate and make fiscal policy. But in California's Constitution, the distinction between framework and policy is hopelessly muddled. Many other states are offenders in this regard, but California is among the worst. We have loaded our Constitution with budget junk, with tax and spending limitations, with spending mandates and protected programs. Again and again, California and its voters have accepted the argument that a particular policy outcome is so important that it cannot be left to the ordinary tug and pull of politics. We've been told that unless we pass constitutional requirements about how much we spend on education and constitutional requirements for supermajorities on taxes and spending bills, we're told that our schools will crumble and our taxes would soar. But the evidence doesn't seem to support these claims. If you look across the states, spending limitations and supermajority requirements for budgets, if anything, actually seem to result in higher spending. Requiring supermajorities to pass tax increases leads to somewhat lower levels of taxation, but in California, they certainly haven't been low enough to suit any of those people shouting on talk radio. And 2 decades of Proposition 98, our school funding guarantee, have left California with schools funded at lower levels than in states without such guarantees, And indeed, in California, we're spending at lower levels than prevailed when Ronald Reagan was governor. What we have gotten from all these constraints is more borrowing and less flexibility to deal with crises like we have in the current recession. So I'm going to let you in on a policy wonk secret. Democracy is not only fairer than minority rule, it actually is fiscally more responsible. And I think California really ought to give it a try. So, in thinking about a constitutional convention and what we ought to do by way of budget reform in the Constitution, I think we ought to be thinking more about subtraction than addition. When it comes to the fiscal provisions in a new Constitution, less is more. What we need is a clean and uncomplicated set of rules, like the one we have in our federal Constitution for public finance, rules that don't enshrine the policy wishes of either the left or the right in our fundamental governing document. But this is where the rub comes in. Right now, the Constitution is loaded with lots of policy victories cherished by both the left and the right. They will both fight hard to protect those victories unless, as part of the constitutional process, they get something important in return. Also, ordinary Californians deeply distrust state government and especially the legislature. They believe lawmakers are often more interested in their own careers and the groups that fund them than in the welfare of ordinary people like them. They don't think the legislature is responsive to their concerns and accountable for its actions, and too often they're simply right. So here is where we come to my second subject. We need to remake the legislature and the system by which we elect it. If California voters are to be persuaded to eliminate the two-thirds rules, which they see mistakenly as a form of budget discipline, they must be offered an alternative system that assures them they can hold the legislature accountable if it tries to put special interests ahead of the public good in budgeting. So how do we get a more responsive and accountable legislature? Well, it would certainly have to look very different than the current system. Right now, the clustering of Californians into communities of the like-minded makes it inevitable under our current system that the great majority of districts in the legislature will be uncompetitive in general elections, often for decades, even under the fairest schemes of redistricting or even under a different primary system. If you are a Republican in the Bay Area or Santa Monica, or a Democrat in most parts of inland California, or an independent or third-party voter almost anywhere in the state, there is little reason for the candidate of the majority party to pay any attention to your values, your needs, or your hopes. Your vote under the current system simply doesn't count. Unless, of course, you have lots of money. California's huge legislative districts, nearly 500,000 persons for an assembly seat, nearly 1 million for a Senate seat, assure that our election campaigns will be tremendously expensive. For contested assembly seats, candidates last year were spending $2, $3, $4 million of their own, and special interest groups poured in millions of their own money in independent expenditure campaigns. In this current decade, $1 billion has been raised and spent to elect and defeat candidates for state office, according to the Fair Political Practice Commission. To address these kind of problems, my colleague Micah Weinberg and I have put together a proposal for what a better legislature and electoral system might look like in California. There's a summary of our proposal available outside on the table, and the full report is available on the web at www.newamerica.net. But I'll just briefly sketch what we have in mind. Under our plan, California would have a unicameral legislature elected in 8 regional elections around the state. Legislative seats in that legislature would be apportioned to the regions based on their population. Half the seats would be elected from geographic districts, just like we do now, although the districts would be far less populous than the current system. And the other half of the legislators would be elected, the regional representation, through a system would be determined by proportional representation. Now, this system is nothing new. It's known as mixed member proportional representation, and it's used in many of the nations around the world, from Germany to New Zealand. Under our plan, every region would have a focused and visible campaign in which to discuss California's issues. Voters unhappy with the direction of the state could make themselves heard, because under proportional representation, every vote counts. In this system, whether you're a Democrat in Kern County or a Republican in Santa Monica or a Green anywhere, your vote would matter in determining the partisan control of the legislature. And that is what California needs. Even if we make it possible for the elected majority in the legislature and the governor to write budgets and set policy, we must also make it possible for voters to change the majority if they don't like the result. The big earthquakes in California's fiscal life over the last 3 decades, from Prop 13 forward, have been triggered when Sacramento ignored or lagged behind the wishes of the electorate. A lack of political accountability and leadership has led to fiscal shackles and straitjackets, which have led in turn to gridlock and crisis. So I will say it again, political reform and fiscal reforms are 2 halves of one walnut. We won't get one without the other, and we won't get either without a constitutional convention. Thank you.